April 19th, 1848. Multan Citadel, Punjab. Patrick Vans. Agnew lay dying in a pool of his own blood, hacked by swords wielded by men he'd trusted hours earlier. The 24-year-old British political agent had come to this ancient fortress city to facilitate a peaceful transition of power. Instead, he became the spark that would ignite the Second Anglo-Sikh War, a conflagration that would determine whether the richest province in India would remain independent or fall under British control forever. 200 miles away in the remote outpost of Banu, a 28-year-old lieutenant named Herbert Benjamin Edwards received the blood-stained letter describing Agnew's murder. He stood at an impossible crossroads. Every protocol, every military manual, every ounce of common sense told him to wait for orders from his superiors in Lahore. But waiting meant letting rebellion spread like wildfire across the Punjab. It meant allowing Diwan Mulraj, the rebel governor barricaded in Multan's impregnable fortress with 12,000 battle-hardened troops, to rally the entire Sikh nation to his cause. Edwards had no military training. He commanded no regular troops. He possessed no heavy artillery. He couldn't even wait for reinforcements, because the scorching heat of the Indian summer and the coming monsoons made large-scale military operations suicidal for European soldiers. His superiors in Lahore and Calcutta had already decided to do nothing until November, 6 months away. By then, all of northern India could be in flames. This was the most catastrophic rebellion the British East India Company had faced since conquering Bengal a century earlier. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this mattered more than just another colonial skirmish. Why the decisions made in the sweltering heat of that Punjab summer determined the future of the entire Indian subcontinent for the next 100 years. Why a single untrained officer's desperate gamble prevented a disaster that could have cost Britain its empire. And why this 9-month siege has been somehow forgotten by everyone except military historians who recognize it as one of the most audacious campaigns in the history of irregular warfare. The rebellion at Multan was no ordinary uprising. This was the death rattle of the last independent Indian power capable of challenging British supremacy, the legendary Sikh empire that had once made even Napoleon's generals pause in admiration. And Herbert Edwards? He was about to attempt something that every military expert considered impossible. But we can't just jump straight to the desperate battles that would rage around Multan's ancient walls. Without understanding the context, without grasping what was really at stake in the spring of 1848, the magnitude of what Edwards achieved becomes invisible, reduced to just another obscure colonial footnote. We need to go back to when the Sikh Empire stood as the last barrier between the British East India Company and total domination of India. The Punjab in 1848 was unlike anywhere else in India. For thousands of years, this fertile land between 5 great rivers, the Punjab literally means land of 5 rivers, had been the gateway through which every great conqueror entered India. Alexander the Great had fought his hardest battle here. The Mughals had built their empire from this base. And in 1818, a one-eyed warrior king named Maharaja Ranjit Singh had forged these warring territories into the most formidable military power in South Asia. Ranjit Singh's Khalsa army was no ragtag militia. He'd hired French and Italian officers who'd served under Napoleon to train his troops in European tactics. He'd purchased the finest artillery money could buy. His soldiers, predominantly Sikh, but including Muslims and Hindus united under his banner, had conquered Kashmir, beaten back Afghan invaders, and created a professional fighting force of 100,000 men that could match British regiments blow for blow. Even the British, with all their industrial might, had never dared invade the Punjab while the Lion of Lahore lived. But Ranjit Singh died in 1839, and with him died the unity of his empire. What followed was a nightmare of palace intrigue, assassinations, and power struggles that would have made the Borgias blush. Within 5 years, 4 different Maharajas had been murdered or deposed. The Khalsa army, unpaid and leaderless, became a state within a state, a ferociously disciplined military machine that now answered to no one. By 1845, the powder keg exploded into the First Anglo-Sikh War. The British won that war, barely. At battles like Firoz Shah and Sobraon, British and company forces suffered casualties that shocked London, thousands of dead in single-afternoon engagements against an enemy who fought with terrifying courage and surprising tactical sophistication. The Treaty of Lahore that ended the war in 1846 was supposed to pacify the Punjab. The Sikhs ceded valuable territory, paid massive indemnities, and accepted a British resident in Lahore to advise the child Maharaja Duleep Singh, who was only 7 years old. But this wasn't peace. This was occupation with a thin veneer of independence. The British strategy was to rule through puppet Sikh governors while slowly dismantling the Khalsa army piece by piece. They exiled Maharani Jind Kaur, Duleep Singh's formidable mother, who tried to rule as regent. They installed loyal administrators in key provinces. And they demanded that local governors, called Diwans, pay hefty taxes to the Lahore treasury, which was now controlled by British officials. It was humiliating. Proud Sikh Sardars who'd commanded armies now had to obey pink-faced British lieutenants barely out of their 20s. Governors who'd ruled like independent princes were reduced to tax collectors for a foreign power. The entire edifice of indirect rule rested on one assumption, that the Sikh leadership, having been defeated once, would never dare rebel again. That assumption was about to explode spectacularly. Multan was the key to everything. This ancient city of 80,000 souls sat at the strategic junction of Punjab's southern trade routes, where caravans from Delhi, Kabul, and the Indus Valley converged. Its wealth was legendary. Warehouses bulging with spices, silks, and treasure accumulated over centuries. The fortress itself, with walls 30 feet thick and a citadel rising above the Chenab River, was considered virtually impregnable. Whoever controlled Multan controlled the southern Punjab. Whoever controlled the southern Punjab could choke British supply lines and rally the Muslim population to join a wider rebellion. And Multan's governor, Diwan Mulraj, was nobody's puppet. Mulraj was a Hindu administrator ruling a predominantly Muslim city in a Sikh empire now controlled by Christian foreigners, a balancing act that required extraordinary political skill. He'd managed to maintain practical independence for 3 years after the First Sikh War, paying just enough tribute to avoid British intervention while building his own power base. He commanded 12,000 well-trained troops and possessed artillery that could rival anything the company could field in the region. Early in 1848, the newly appointed British commissioner in the Punjab, Sir Frederick Currie, decided enough was enough. He demanded Mulraj pay all back taxes owed to the Lahore treasury, a sum that would effectively bankrupt Multan and force Mulraj's submission. Mulraj tried to sidestep the trap by abdicating in favor of his son, hoping the British would accept a face-saving compromise. Currie refused. He would install his own man, Sardar Khan Singh, as the new governor. And to ensure compliance, he would send a British political agent to oversee the transition. That agent was Patrick Vans Agnew, a capable young officer of the Bombay Civil Service. On April 18, 1848, Agnew arrived at Multan with Lieutenant William Anderson and a tiny escort of Gurkha soldiers. The next morning, Mulraj conducted the 2 British officers to the citadel and formally handed over the keys. Everything seemed cordial, proper, civilized, as Agnew and Anderson rode out of the citadel. A soldier from Mulraj's army struck Agnew with a sword. What happened next remains debated. Did Mulraj order the attack? Probably not. He'd have been mad to murder British envoys and invite immediate retaliation. More likely, his troops, sensing their pay and positions were about to vanish, took matters into their own hands. But it didn't matter. Within minutes, Agnew and Anderson were hacked to death by a mob of soldiers while Mulraj's guards stood by and watched. Agnew, grievously wounded but still alive, managed to scrawl 2 desperate messages. One went to the British resident in Lahore, detailing the attack. The other went to Lieutenant Herbert Edwards in Bannu, begging for immediate military assistance. Then Patrick Vans. Agnew died. His head was cut from his body and his corpse mutilated. The message was clear to every Sikh Sardar and Khalsa soldier across the Punjab. The British could be challenged. The British could be killed. The British were not invincible. And that's exactly what terrified everyone in Calcutta and London who understood what was about to unfold. This wasn't just about 2 dead officers. This was about the stability of British rule across India. If the Punjab rose in general rebellion, if the 60,000 remaining Khalsa soldiers joined Mul Raj, if the Afghan Amir saw an opportunity to reclaim lost territory, the entire British position in northern India could collapse like a house of cards. The company had only 40,000 European soldiers in all of India to control a population of 200 million. They relied absolutely on sepoy troops whose loyalty was conditional. If they lost control of the Punjab, with its martial traditions, its strategic position, and its wealth, the dominoes could fall all the way to Calcutta. In London, the directors of the East India Company understood that empires are fragile things. Prestige matters. The appearance of strength matters. Let one determined rebel succeed, and every subjugated prince from Burma to Gwalior starts calculating his own odds of rebellion. But here's what made the situation truly catastrophic. The British couldn't respond. Commander-in-Chief Sir Hugh Gough had just fought the First Sikh War and knew intimately how costly even a victorious campaign could be. Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, newly arrived in India, was obsessed with cutting costs after the expensive wars of the 1840s. Both men agreed, no major military operations during the hot season. European troops simply couldn't march and fight in temperatures that regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Wait for November, when the monsoons had ended and the heat had broken. Then crush Mul Raj with overwhelming force. It was the rational decision, the prudent decision, the decision that would minimize British casualties. It was also a decision that could lose them an empire, because every day of delay gave Mul Raj time to strengthen his defenses, rally supporters, and turn his personal rebellion into a national uprising. Every week the British did nothing, sent a message of weakness to every ambitious Sardar in the Punjab. The Khalsa army hadn't been truly defeated in the last war. It had been outmaneuvered and politically undermined. Those soldiers were still there, still armed, still burning with humiliation. If they saw an opportunity to restore Sikh independence, they would take it. This was the nightmare scenario. This was why junior British officers in the Punjab were screaming for immediate action while their superiors in Lahore and Calcutta counseled patience. This was the impossible dilemma: act rashly and potentially sacrifice thousands of European troops to heat stroke and disease, or wait prudently and potentially face a rebellion that could spiral completely out of control. And this was the moment when Herbert Benjamin Edwards, a 28-year-old lieutenant with no formal military training and no authorization whatsoever, decided he wasn't going to wait. There was one man who thought differently about what was possible in the Punjab, a man who believed that audacity and improvisation could accomplish what orthodox military doctrine said was impossible. On that April morning, when he received Agnew's blood-stained letter, Herbert Edwards made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wouldn't wait for orders. He wouldn't wait for reinforcements. He wouldn't wait for the hot season to pass. He would raise an army from nothing and march immediately against Multan. Everyone who knew military affairs understood this was insane. Edwards was committing career suicide at minimum, potentially treason at worst. If he failed, and how could he possibly succeed, he would be court-martialed and disgraced. If he somehow won, he'd be praised for insubordination, which was almost worse. The proper thing to do was forward Agnew's letter to Lahore and await instructions like a good officer. But Herbert Edwards had never been a conventional officer. Born in 1819 in the English county of Shropshire, Edwards was the second son of a country rector who died when Herbert was only 4 years old. Raised by a deeply religious aunt after his mother's death, young Edwards grew up poor but educated, combining fierce Protestant faith with romantic literary sensibilities. He excelled at King's College London, writing poetry and winning debating contests, dreaming of making his mark on the world. But without money or connections, his options were limited. The army seemed his only path to adventure and advancement. Through a family friend, he secured a cadetship in the Bengal Infantry and sailed for India in 1841, aged 22, burning with ambition and utterly ignorant of what awaited him. For 5 years, he served as a junior officer in the 1st Bengal European Regiment, first at Dinapore, then at Karnal on the frontier. Most young British officers spent these years drinking, gambling, and complaining about the heat. Edwards threw himself into learning. He mastered Hindustani, Urdu, and Persian, the 3 languages essential for anyone who wanted to understand India. He studied local politics, religious customs, tribal allegiances, and crucially, he started writing. His essays in the Delhi Gazette, written under the pseudonym Brahmini Bull, offered sharp, often critical commentary on British policy in India. He argued for respecting local customs, for governing through influence rather than force, for understanding that Indians weren't children to be lectured, but people with their own complex motivations and aspirations. His writing was so incisive that it caught the attention of the Commander-in-Chief himself, Sir Hugh Gough, who appointed Edwards to his personal staff. Then came the First Anglo-Sikh War in 1845-1846. Edwards saw how close the British came to disaster, how the Khalsa fought with ferocious discipline, how only British artillery superiority and Sikh political divisions prevented outright defeat. He understood that the peace was temporary, that resentment smoldered beneath Punjab's surface like fire under ash. In February 1847, at age 28, Edwards received the appointment that would change everything: political agent for Banu. Banu was about as far from civilization as you could get in British India, a rough frontier district beyond the Indus River, populated by warlike Pashtun tribes who paid nominal allegiance to the Sikh Empire, but basically governed themselves through blood feuds and tribal councils. The previous administrators had failed completely to collect taxes or maintain order. Edwards was told to fix it. He arrived in Banu with a tiny military escort and a task that seemed hopeless. He needed to convince tribes that had been fighting each other for generations to submit to taxation and British authority, all without enough troops to enforce compliance and without speaking their languages fluently. Edwards did something revolutionary. He learned to negotiate. Instead of demanding submission, he started mediating disputes. He would ride out, often alone, often unarmed, to tribal councils and propose solutions to feuds that had been killing people for decades. Gradually, suspicion turned to respect. He built roads and irrigation canals using local labor, creating jobs and improving agriculture. He established markets where tribes could trade safely. He demolished robber strongholds, but spared the inhabitants when they swore peace. Most importantly, he kept his word. When he promised protection, he delivered it. When he promised punishment, he followed through. When he promised fair judgment, he gave it without favor. Within a year, Banu was transformed. Tax revenue flowed to Lahore for the first time in living memory. Feuds were settled by arbitration rather than bloodshed. The Pashtuns, who'd lived in chaos for generations, had discovered that order could actually benefit them. They came to trust this strange young Englishman who treated them like partners rather than subjects. The town he established was named Edwardisabad in his honor, a name that survived until Pakistan's independence in 1947 when it reverted to Banu. But while Edwards worked his administrative miracle in a remote frontier district, he was also learning lessons that would prove crucial when faced with military crisis. He learned that irregular troops, tribesmen fighting for pay and plunder rather than patriotism, could be extraordinarily effective if properly led and motivated. He learned that personal relationships and reputation mattered more than formal authority in tribal societies. He learned that audacity and quick action could achieve things that methodical planning couldn't. He learned that sometimes you had to trust your judgment, even when it contradicted conventional wisdom. By April 1848, Herbert Edwards had concluded that the British approach to the Punjab was fundamentally unsustainable. You couldn't rule through puppets while systematically humiliating the martial class that had defended their independence for generations. You couldn't dismantle the Khalsa without providing alternative employment and dignity for 60,000 professional soldiers. You couldn't impose British control while pretending the Sikh Empire still existed. Something had to give. And when Mulraj murdered Agnew and Anderson, Edwards knew instantly what was about to happen next. Either the British would respond immediately and decisively, crushing the rebellion before it could spread, or they would hesitate and watch the Punjab explode into general war. His superiors had chosen to hesitate, so Edwards decided he would act alone. Most military commanders thought what Edwards was attempting was impossible. Let's stack the obstacles systematically so you can appreciate just how audacious or insane his plan actually was. First, Edwards had no army. Zero. His military resources consisted of a single regiment of Sikh infantry stationed in Banu to support his administrative work, and their loyalty was now deeply questionable given that he was about to attack fellow Sikhs. He would need to raise an entirely new military force from tribes that had been fighting each other and the Sikhs for generations. Second, he had no authorization. Neither the resident in Lahore nor the Governor-General in Calcutta had authorized military action. If Edwards marched against Multan and failed, he would be solely responsible for starting a war without permission. Even if he succeeded, he could face court-martial for insubordination. The official policy was to wait until November. Edwards was about to flagrantly violate that policy. Third, he had no European officers to help him lead irregular troops. He would have to do this essentially alone, with perhaps one or two junior lieutenants who happened to be in the region. Managing Pashtun tribesmen who barely spoke his language, coordinating with Sikh regiments of dubious loyalty, maintaining supply lines across hostile territory. All of this would fall on his inexperienced shoulders. Fourth, he had no artillery worth mentioning. Multan's fortress walls were 30 feet thick in places, studded with 54 cannon and 12 mortars. The citadel towered above the city on a rocky prominence, virtually impregnable to assault without heavy siege guns. Edwards would be marching against one of the most formidable fortresses in India with nothing heavier than a few light field pieces. Fifth, he had no money. Raising troops cost money. Buying supplies costs money. Even Pashtun irregulars fighting for plunder needed advance payment and regular wages or they'd simply melt away and go home. Edwards couldn't wait months for the company treasury to authorize funds. He'd have to beg, borrow, and improvise. Sixth, he faced impossible logistics. Marching an army across the Punjab in June meant dealing with temperatures that could kill European soldiers within hours of exposure. It meant finding water sources in a landscape baking under relentless sun. It meant keeping hundreds or thousands of men and animals fed in territory where local grain supplies were already strained. Professional quartermaster officers with decades of experience struggled with such challenges. Edwards was a political administrator with no supply training. Seventh, time was his enemy. Every day he spent organizing gave Mulraj another day to strengthen Multan's defenses, bury more artillery, enlist more troops, and rally supporters across the Punjab. But rushing forward with an unprepared army would be suicide against a well-fortified position defended by 12,000 battle-hardened soldiers. Eighth, Mulraj wasn't some incompetent rebel. He was an experienced administrator who'd governed Multan for years, understood military affairs, and commanded absolute loyalty from his troops. He'd had 3 years since the First Sikh War to prepare for potential British intervention. His fortress was stocked with supplies that could sustain a year-long siege. His treasury held £3 million sterling, enough wealth to buy mercenaries, bribe allies, and sustain prolonged resistance. Ninth, political complications made everything worse. If Edwards attacked Mulraj aggressively, he'd risk provoking other Sikh Sardars into joining the rebellion out of ethnic solidarity. If he appeared weak or hesitant, those same Sardars would smell British vulnerability and rebel anyway. The entire Punjab was watching to see what happened at Multan. One wrong move could turn a local uprising into a general catastrophe. 10th, geography favored Mulraj completely. Multan sat at the junction of major rivers, with the Chenab protecting its northern approaches. An attacker would have to cross water obstacles under artillery fire, assault prepared fortifications, and maintain supply lines across territory where every village might be hostile. And finally, the ultimate nightmare. Edwards couldn't simply besiege Multan and wait for the fortress to starve. If he tied his forces down in a static siege, he'd be vulnerable to relief armies sent by other Sikh Sardars who decided to join Mulraj's rebellion. He'd be exposed to Afghan intervention from the northwest. He'd watch his irregular troops desert as the campaign dragged on without plunder or progress. A prolonged siege was impossible. A quick assault without heavy artillery was suicide. The tactical situation appeared to have no solution. This was an enormous gamble, possibly the greatest military gamble taken by any British officer in India during the entire colonial period. Herbert Edwards was risking his reputation, his career, and quite literally his life on the belief that audacity and improvisation could overcome impossible odds. He would later write in his memoir, "I felt I was at a turning point. Every regulation, every piece of military wisdom, every voice of caution said wait. But I knew in my bones that waiting meant disaster. Sometimes you must throw the manual away and trust to providence and determined men." On the morning of April 20th, 1848, less than 24 hours after learning of Agnew's murder, Herbert Edwards sent word to every Pashtun Malik, chief, in Banu and the surrounding districts. He was raising an army to punish the murderers at Multan. There would be pay, plunder, and glory for those who joined him. There would be punishment for those who refused. The response stunned even Edwards. Within 3 days, 2,000 Pashtun irregulars had assembled. Tough frontier fighters who'd been raiding each other's villages for generations, but now saw an opportunity for sanctioned plunder against wealthy Multan. Within a week, the number swelled to 4,000. These were some of the most feared warriors in India. Men who'd learned to fight practically from birth, who viewed warfare as both livelihood and entertainment, who possessed an almost supernatural ability to endure hardship and march impossible distances. They were also completely undisciplined, barely controllable, liable to desert at any moment if they weren't paid or saw better opportunities elsewhere. Commanding such troops was like riding a tiger, exhilarating but deadly if you made one wrong move. Edwards then did something that shocked the Pashtuns. He paid them in advance. Using his own credit and promises to the company treasury, he distributed immediate wages. He showed them respect instead of contempt. He learned their names, joked with their leaders, shared their rations. Most British officers treated irregulars as expendable savages. Edwards treated them as valuable allies whose knowledge and fighting skills he genuinely respected. The Pashtuns responded with surprising loyalty. They'd follow this crazy young Englishman who actually seemed to care whether they lived or died, who promised them fair shares of plunder, who led from the front rather than commanding from the rear. But Edwards still needed more than just irregular cavalry and infantry. He needed artillery. He needed professional soldiers who understood formal battlefield tactics. He needed legitimacy, some connection to proper military authority that would prevent his entire expedition from being labeled an outlaw adventure. His solution was brilliant and desperate in equal measure. He contacted 2 Sikh regimental commanders, Colonel Henry Lawrence Van Cortlandt and another officer, whose troops were stationed in the region and supposedly loyal to the British-controlled Lahore Durbar. These were Khalsa regulars, 2 full infantry battalions with their own artillery batteries. Edwards's pitch was, Simple. March with me against Mulraj. Prove your loyalty to the new order in Punjab, and share in the glory and plunder when Multan falls. Refuse, and you'll be marked as potential rebels yourselves. Van Cortlandt, an Anglo-Indian soldier of fortune who'd served the Sikh Empire for years, agreed. His motives were complex, partly genuine loyalty to his British employers, partly recognition that his own position depended on maintaining good relations with British power, partly the lure of plunder from Multan's legendary wealth. By early June, Edwards had assembled something that vaguely resembled an army. Approximately 4,000 Pashtun irregulars, 2 battalions of Sikh infantry, perhaps 2,000 men total, and a dozen artillery pieces ranging from light field guns to a few heavier pieces. It was nowhere near enough to take Multan by storm, but it might be enough to prevent Mulraj from launching counter-offensives, to demonstrate British resolve, and, most importantly, to buy time until more substantial forces could be assembled. The plan was audacious. Edwards would march rapidly toward Multan, engage Mulraj's forces in the field before they could retreat behind the fortress walls, and hopefully win a decisive victory that would break rebel morale. If he could defeat Mulraj's field army, he could at least blockade the city and prevent the rebellion from spreading. Everyone who understood military affairs gave Edwards minimal chances of success. The resident in Lahore, Sir Frederick Currie, was appalled when he learned what Edwards was attempting. Lord Dalhousie in Calcutta considered it reckless adventurism. Even officers who admired Edwards's courage thought he was probably marching to his death. But none of them stopped him, because deep down they all knew that someone had to do something, and Edwards was the only man willing to try. On June 15, 1848, Herbert Edwards led his improvised army out of Banu, marching southwest toward Multan. The temperature hovered around 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Dust storms choked the men. Water was scarce. The Pashtuns grumbled constantly. The Sikh troops eyed their British commander with open suspicion. Edwards rode at the head of his column, wearing his British uniform despite the heat, carrying Agnew's blood-stained letter in his pocket as a reminder of what was at stake. He was risking everything on the belief that fortune favors the bold, that sometimes, in the chaos of history, one determined man can change the course of empires. The approach to Multan would prove him spectacularly right. On June 18, 1848, as the sun climbed toward its merciless zenith, Edwards's leading elements reached the Chenab River. This was the moment of truth. The Chenab, one of Punjab's 5 great rivers, flowed brown and swift between Edwards and Multan. To reach the city, his army would have to cross at ferry points where Mulraj's forces surely waited in strength. Intelligence reports suggested that Mulraj had deployed 8,000 troops, infantry, cavalry, and artillery to contest any British crossing. Edwards's Pashtun irregulars began boarding the few available ferry boats under cover of early morning. The operation was agonizingly slow. Each boat could carry perhaps 30 men. With hostile forces on the opposite bank, every crossing was a gamble. Mulraj's artillery opened fire as the first boats reached the western shore. Cannonballs plowed into the riverbank, sending geysers of mud and water skyward. Men dove for cover behind whatever minimal shelter they could find. The Pashtuns, brave as they were, had little experience with sustained artillery bombardment. They huddled under the barrage for hours, unable to advance or retreat, watching the boats make their slow trips back and forth across the Chenab while death rained from Mulraj's guns. This was the nightmare scenario. Edwards's forces were stuck on the riverbank, pinned by artillery, vulnerable to a massed infantry charge that could sweep them back into the river. If Mulraj had attacked at that moment with his full strength, he might have destroyed Edwards's army before it even formed. But Mulraj was cautious. He kept his main forces back, content to let his artillery do the work. This gave Edwards precious hours to get more troops across and, crucially, to bring Van Cortlandt's artillery into action. By midday, Van Cortlandt had positioned his guns and began counter-battery fire. The Sikh gunners knew their craft. They'd been trained by European officers and possessed excellent weapons. Within an hour, they'd silenced several of Mulraj's batteries and created enough suppression for Edwards's infantry to finally advance from the riverbank. Now Mulraj made his move. He sent his cavalry and infantry forward to sweep the invaders back into the Chenab. What happened next became legendary in Pashtun oral histories. The Multani forces, well-armed, disciplined, fighting on familiar ground, advanced in traditional battle order toward what they assumed would be an easy victory over disorganized irregulars. But as they closed the distance, Van Cortlandt's artillery switched from counter-battery work to canister shot, essentially turning cannons into giant shotguns that scythed through infantry ranks at close range. The Pashtuns, seeing their moment, charged. This wasn't organized warfare. This was controlled chaos. Individual warriors and small groups flowing around obstacles, using every bit of cover, firing their matchlock muskets and then closing with tulwar swords and knives for brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Multanis, trained for formal battlefield tactics, suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy that didn't follow any rules they understood. The Khalsa infantry under Van Cortlandt advanced with textbook precision, maintaining formation under fire, delivering devastating volleys. Between the Sikh regulars' disciplined firepower and the Pashtuns' wild ferocity, Mulraj's forces found themselves caught in a pincer with no good options. The battle raged for 3 hours in heat that felt like fighting inside a furnace. Men collapsed from heat stroke as often as from wounds. Dust so thick you could barely see 20 yards ahead. The crack of musketry, the boom of artillery, the screams of dying men and horses mixing with battle cries in half a dozen languages. Then, Mulraj's formations broke. What had been an organized advance became a panicked retreat. Soldiers threw down weapons and ran. Cavalry abandoned infantry. Within minutes, what had been a dangerous military force became a mob streaming back toward Multan's walls. The Pashtuns pursued with savage glee, cutting down stragglers, stripping corpses, claiming weapons and horses as plunder. Edwards had to personally ride between his irregulars and Mulraj's fleeing troops to prevent a massacre that would have made future negotiations impossible. When the dust cleared, Mulraj had lost 500 casualties and 6 artillery pieces. More importantly, he'd lost the psychological advantage. His troops had been beaten in open battle by an improvised force led by a junior British officer. The aura of invincibility he'd tried to create by murdering Agnew had been shattered. But the Battle of Kinairi, as it came to be known, also revealed Edwards's limitations. He'd won the field battle, but Multan's walls still stood impregnable. His artillery was too light to breach the fortress. His irregular troops, flush with their first victory, were already grumbling about plunder and threatening to go home with what they'd captured unless paid immediately. Edwards sent urgent messages to Lahore. He'd stopped Mulraj's field forces, but he needed reinforcements, heavy siege gun, and above all, regular troops who could maintain a proper siege. Without substantial help, his victory at Kinairi would be meaningless. The resident in Lahore, Frederick Currie, finally recognized that Edwards's unauthorized adventure might actually be succeeding. He authorized a small force from the Bengal army under General William Wish to march to Multan and establish a formal siege. It would take until August for Wish to arrive, but at least help was coming. In the meantime, Edwards wasn't done. Mulraj was regrouping inside Multan, but he'd also sent reinforcements to fortified positions outside the city. If those strong points could be taken, Multan would be completely isolated. On July 3, 1848, Edwards fought his second major battle at Sadhusain, a fortified village near Multan. This time, Mulraj had assembled 12,000 troops, everything he could scrape together from his scattered garrisons and reinforcements trickling in from sympathetic Sardars. The fighting was even fiercer than Kinairi. Edwards had been reinforced by troops from Lieutenant Edward Lake, his fellow political officer, and a substantial contingent from the Nawab of Bahawalpur, a Muslim princely state south of Multan that saw an opportunity to weaken its traditional Sikh rivals. Now Edwards commanded perhaps 8,000 men and significantly more artillery. The battle raged across the dusty plain surrounding Sadhusain. Cavalry charges, artillery duels, infantry engagements at point-blank range. Edwards was in the thick of it. British officers of that era led from the front when disaster struck. He was checking his pistol when it accidentally discharged, mangling his right hand. The wound was agonizing. Blood poured from shattered fingers. Any sensible officer would have retired from the field for medical treatment. Edwards bound the wound with a scrap of cloth and continued commanding, his right hand useless, but his left still capable of holding reins and writing orders. The pain must have been excruciating, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. If his troops saw him carried off wounded, morale might collapse. So he stayed in the saddle, white-faced from pain and blood loss, shouting orders and rallying troops for 7 more hours of brutal combat. By nightfall, Mulraj's forces were again in retreat. The Multanis had fought bravely, but been overwhelmed by Edwards's superior numbers and his troops' growing confidence. Mulraj pulled everything back into the fortress itself, abandoning the surrounding territory to British control. Edwards had accomplished the impossible. In less than 3 weeks, with an improvised army and no authorization, he'd fought 2 significant battles, defeated forces twice his size, captured nearly a dozen enemy guns, and contained Mulraj's rebellion behind Multan's walls. The rebellion that was supposed to spread across the Punjab like wildfire had been stopped cold by one determined lieutenant and his ragtag army of Pashtun tribesmen and questionably loyal Sikh regulars. The injury to his hand would trouble Edwards for the rest of his life. He never regained full use of those fingers. But he'd bought something far more valuable than personal health. Time. Time for the British to assemble overwhelming force. Time to prevent the rebellion from spreading. Time to demonstrate that British authority, however tested, would ultimately prevail. Mulraj was now trapped. He couldn't break out. He couldn't spread rebellion. All he could do was wait behind his massive walls and hope that other Sikh Sardars would rally to his cause. That hope was about to be crushed and then, spectacularly, revived by British miscalculation. By August 18, 1848, General William Wish had arrived with reinforcements from the Bengal army. The siege of Multan could finally begin in earnest. Except it couldn't, because Wish had brought only 8,089 regular troops with 32 siege guns and 12 horse artillery pieces. Add Edwards's irregulars, now numbering about 4,000 cavalry and 7,700 infantry after recruitment, plus the 7,600 troops contributed by the Nawab of Bahawalpur, and the besieging force totaled perhaps 20,000 men. This was nowhere near enough to properly encircle Multan. The city's perimeter stretched for miles. The fortress commanded dominant terrain. Mulraj had 12,000 defenders, 54 artillery pieces, and enough supplies to withstand months of siege. Worse, the hot season still raged. European troops were dying of heat stroke and disease faster than from combat wounds. But the real problem was political. To strengthen Wish's force, Currie had ordered a substantial contingent of Khalsa troops under Sardar Sher Singh Atariwala to join the siege. Sher Singh commanded 3,082 cavalry and 909 infantry, professional soldiers who could tip the balance against Multan. Everyone except Currie recognized this was madness. Sher Singh was the son of Chatar Singh Atariwala, one of the most powerful Sikh Sardars in the Punjab, who was openly preparing for rebellion in the northern territories. Putting Sher Singh's troops into the siege meant placing thousands of potentially hostile soldiers right in the middle of British operations. Multiple British political officers warned that Sher Singh couldn't be trusted. Edwards himself sent urgent messages. "Don't do this. The risk was insane. Curry ignored all warnings. He believed Sher Singh had sworn loyalty to the Lahore Durbar and would honor that oath. He believed the Sikhs would never dare rebel again after being defeated in 1846. On September 14, 1848, Sher Singh and his entire force openly rebelled. They didn't attack the British directly. That would have been suicidal. Instead, Sher Singh simply marched his troops away from Multan, heading north toward his father's strongholds. In one stroke, the besieging force had lost nearly 4,000 troops, and those troops had become potential enemies. Worse, Sher Singh's defection sent a signal to the entire Punjab. The rebellion was spreading. The Khalsa was rising again. The British were vulnerable. Wish and Edwards suddenly found themselves in a terrifying position. They were too weak to maintain the siege properly. They couldn't pursue Sher Singh without abandoning Multan entirely. Their supply lines stretched across territory that might turn hostile at any moment. European troops continued dying from disease. The monsoon season was ending, which meant Gough and Dalhousie would finally authorize major reinforcements. But those reinforcements would take months to assemble and march to Multan. In late September, Wish made the only decision he could: raise the siege. The British forces fell back to defensive positions. Edwards's Pashtun irregulars, seeing no immediate prospect of plunder and having been away from home for months, largely dispersed back to their villages. The Bahawalpur troops also withdrew to defend their own territory. Mulraj had survived. Against all odds, he'd held out long enough for British caution and Sikh betrayal to save him. Inside the fortress, celebrations rang out. Surely this was proof that Allah favored his cause, that the British could be resisted, that independence was, still possible. But Mulraj and Sher Singh made a crucial strategic mistake. Instead of joining forces, which would have created a combined army of nearly 20,000 troops that might have threatened British control of the entire Punjab, they met at a neutral mosque and agreed to go their separate ways. Sher Singh would march north to link up with his father's rebellion. Mulraj would remain in Multan and defend the fortress. This decision doomed them both. Divided, they could be defeated in detail. United, they might have won everything. Through October and early November, the situation hung in agonizing balance. In the north, Sher Singh and his father Chatar Singh were assembling a formidable army. Across the Punjab, other Sardars were watching and calculating. If the British appeared weak, the rebellion could still spread like wildfire. But in London and Calcutta, the die was cast. Lord Dalhousie had decided that half measures wouldn't work. The Punjab must be completely subjugated. He authorized massive reinforcements, entire regiments from the Bengal and Bombay armies, heavy siege artillery, months of accumulated supplies brought by steamship up the Indus River. By late November, General Wish returned to Multan at the head of 32,000 troops. 15,000 were European, British regulars and Irish troops of the East India Company's Bengal and Bombay forces. The rest were sepoy infantry, cavalry, and artillery that had proven their loyalty through the crisis. Most importantly, Wish now commanded 150 artillery pieces, including massive siege guns capable of reducing the thickest walls to rubble. The real siege of Multan was about to begin. November 27th, 1848. The British siege lines crept closer to Multan's walls under cover of darkness. Wish had learned from the failed summer siege. Instead of trying to encircle the entire city, he concentrated his forces against specific sectors where his artillery could create killing zones. Trenches snaked forward through the dusty plain, zigzagging to avoid enfilade fire from the fortress. Every night, sappers dug new positions, pushed earthworks closer, established firing positions for the siege guns. Mulraj's artillery dueled constantly with British batteries. The boom of cannon fire echoed across the Punjab day and night. Inside the fortress, defenders watched the British siege works creep inexorably closer and knew their time was running out. On December 27th, Wish judged his preparations complete. The bombardment began in earnest. 150 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The sound was indescribable, a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard 50 miles away. The earth shook. Buildings inside Multan collapsed under the relentless pounding. Walls that had stood for centuries began to crack. Mulraj's return fire was fierce, but increasingly ineffective. His gunners were brave and skilled, but they were outnumbered 3-1 and facing artillery techniques, refined through decades of European warfare. One by one, Multan's defensive batteries were silenced, guns dismounted, crews killed, magazines detonated by plunging fire. By December 30th, 2 massive breaches had been blown in the city walls. The morning sun revealed gaping holes 20 yards wide where solid masonry had stood the night before. Debris choked the approaches. Dead defenders lay in heaps. Then disaster struck for Mulraj. The main powder magazine in the citadel exploded. The blast was colossal. It killed 800 defenders instantly. The shock wave flattened buildings across Multan. A mushroom cloud of smoke and debris rose thousands of feet into the air. For a moment, both sides ceased fire, stunned by the catastrophic detonation. Mulraj sent a defiant message to Wish. The explosion wouldn't save the British. He still had enough powder to last a year. He would fight to the last man. It was magnificent bravado. It was also pointless. On December 31st, Mulraj attempted a sortie against British siege lines, hoping to spike some of the heavy guns and buy more time. The attack was thrown back with heavy losses. On January 2nd, 1849, Wish ordered the final assault. At dawn, British and sepoy troops stormed the breaches. The fighting was apocalyptic, hand-to-hand combat amid rubble and smoke, defenders selling their lives as dearly as possible, attackers driven by months of frustration and the promise that the siege was finally ending. Room by room, street by street, the defenders were pushed back. The battle became urban warfare at its most brutal, snipers firing from windows, grenades thrown into buildings, small groups of soldiers fighting savage close-quarters actions in dark alleys. Civilians caught in the crossfire died by the hundreds. By nightfall, British troops controlled most of the city. Only the inner citadel still held out, where Mulraj and his remaining defenders had retreated for a last stand. For 3 more weeks, the fighting continued. The citadel was even more formidable than the city walls, but Mulraj's garrison was shattered. Casualties had been catastrophic. Supplies were running low, and most importantly, there was no hope of relief. Sher Singh's northern rebellion had been engaged by the main British army under Gough. No help was coming. On January 22, 1849, Dewan Mulraj walked out of his citadel and surrendered to Herbert Edwardes, the same lieutenant whose unauthorized campaign 9 months earlier had started this entire siege. It was a poignant moment. 2 men who'd never met, one a Hindu governor fighting to preserve some scrap of independence, one a young British officer fighting to prevent imperial collapse, stood face to face amid the ruins of what had been one of India's richest cities. Mulraj was dignified in defeat. Edwards was gracious in victory. The terms were surprisingly lenient. Mulraj's life would be spared. He would be imprisoned for life, but not executed. His family would be provided for. His troops who surrendered would be pardoned. The siege of Multan was over. It had lasted 9 months. From April 19, 1848, when Agnew was murdered, to January 22, 1849, when Mulraj surrendered. British casualties totaled 210 killed and 910 wounded, remarkably light considering the scale and duration of operations. Mulraj's forces had suffered catastrophic losses, probably 3,000 killed, thousands more wounded, and the complete destruction of his military power. The wealth seized from Multan was staggering. Mulraj's treasury alone contained £3 million, a fortune that would be split between the British government, the company, and the troops as prize money. There were also vast stores of grain, weapons, and trade goods. Every soldier in the siege force received substantial bonuses. But the true significance of Multan's fall went far beyond looted treasure. The fall of Multan sent shockwaves through the Punjab that determined the outcome of the entire Second Anglo-Sikh War. First, it freed Wish's army, particularly those 150 heavy siege guns, to reinforce Gov's main force fighting Sher Singh and Chatar Singh in the northern Punjab. Those artillery pieces would prove decisive at the Battle of Gujarat in February 1849, where concentrated British firepower shattered the last major Khalsa army. Second, it demonstrated conclusively that British power, once fully mobilized, was overwhelming. Sardars, who'd been calculating whether to join the rebellion, looked at Multan's ruins and thought better of it. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had fallen. The governor, who'd defied the British for 9 months, was now in chains. The lesson was clear. Resistance was futile. Third, it validated Edwards's initial judgment. If he'd waited until November, as his superiors originally insisted, Mulraj would have had 6 additional months to fortify Multan, rally supporters, and coordinate with other rebels. The rebellion might have spread too far to contain. By acting immediately in April, despite lacking authorization or adequate forces, Edwards had bought the crucial time that allowed the British to respond effectively. Fourth, the victory at Multan demonstrated that the company's sepoy troops would remain loyal even when fighting against fellow Indians. This was critical intelligence. British control of India rested absolutely on the assumption that Indian soldiers would obey British officers even when ordered to suppress Indian resistance. Multan proved that assumption remained valid, at least in 1848. 9 years later, that assumption would catastrophically fail in the Indian Mutiny, but that's another story. Fifth, the siege established the template for how the British would subjugate the rest of the Punjab. Concentrate overwhelming force. Use artillery superiority to reduce fortifications. Offer lenient terms to those who surrendered quickly, but show no mercy to continued resistance. Within 3 months of Multan's fall, the entire Punjab had been annexed. On March 29, 1849, the Governor-General formally proclaimed the annexation of the Punjab and the dissolution of the Sikh Empire. 10-year-old Maharaja Duleep Singh was removed from his throne and eventually exiled to England, where he lived out his days as a curious aristocratic pet of the British establishment. The Khalsa army was disbanded. The independent Sikh state that had defied Afghan and British expansion for decades simply ceased to exist. The Punjab became a province of British India, ruled directly rather than through puppet governors. Ironically, the Sikhs adapted to British rule with remarkable pragmatism. Within a generation, Sikh regiments would become among the most loyal and effective troops in the British Indian Army, fighting for the crown from the northwest frontier to World War I trenches. But we shouldn't skip past the human cost. The siege of Multan killed thousands of people, most of them civilians caught in the crossfire. Corporal John Ryder of the Bombay Fusiliers wrote after the siege, "Mountains of dead lay in every part of the town, and heaps of human ashes in every square, where bodies had been burnt as they were killed. Some were only half consumed. Many had been gnawed and pulled to pieces by dogs, and arms, legs, heads, and other parts lay in every place. The town swarmed with millions of flies." Each of those casualties represented a person, a soldier fighting for his homeland, a civilian trying to survive, a family destroyed. Wars, even justified ones, exact terrible prices. The courage of Mulraj's defenders deserves recognition even as we acknowledge their defeat. They fought against impossible odds for a cause they believed in, and that deserves respect. Herbert Edwards received a hero's welcome. He was knighted, promoted, awarded prize money that made him financially secure for life. He became the hero of Multan in British military folklore. But the physical and mental toll was severe. His wounded hand never fully healed. The stress of command at age 28 had aged him prematurely. He would serve in India for another decade with distinction, but the Multan campaign remained the defining achievement of his career. When the Indian Mutiny erupted in 1857, Edwards played a crucial role in keeping the Punjab quiet, preventing the rebellion from spreading north and allowing British forces to concentrate on retaking Delhi. But by 1859, his health was so broken that he returned to England permanently, dying in 1868 at only 49 years old, burned out by the intensity of his service. So why has the Siege of Multan faded from popular memory when it was arguably the key campaign that secured British control of the entire subcontinent? First, the sheer complexity of the context makes the story hard to tell. Understanding Multan requires knowing about the First Anglo-Sikh War, the structure of the Khalsa, the political intrigue in Lahore, the role of puppet, governments, and indirect rule. It's not a simple story of good versus evil or brave defenders versus evil invaders. It's a complicated tale of empire, rebellion, improvisation, and the death of the last independent Indian power. Complicated stories don't become popular legends. Second, Multan wasn't the final decisive moment of the Second Anglo-Sikh War. That honor belongs to the Battle of Gujarat in February 1849, where Gough's artillery shattered the main Khalsa army. In popular historical memory, the final battle gets remembered while preliminary campaigns fade into obscurity, even when those preliminary campaigns were strategically crucial. Third, geographic and cultural distance plays a role. Multan is in what's now Pakistan, far from centers of British consciousness. It wasn't on the northwest frontier where great game intrigues captured Victorian imagination. It wasn't part of the mutiny narrative that dominated British understanding of India for generations. It was just a siege in a place most Britons couldn't locate on a map. Fourth, the campaign was overshadowed by later events. Within 9 years, the Indian Mutiny of 1857 would dwarf the Second Sikh War in British historical consciousness. The mutiny directly threatened British rule across India, produced iconic heroes like Henry Havelock and James Neal, and entered Victorian mythology as the great crisis that tested British character. The Sikh Wars, by contrast, were seen as merely mopping up regional resistance, important but not as dramatic. Fifth, political controversies muddied the narrative. Many in Britain thought the Punjab annexation was unjust, that Dalhousie had manufactured excuses to seize territory that could have been governed through alliances. The fact that Mulraj probably hadn't ordered Agnew's murder but merely failed to prevent it complicated the moral clarity. A war that can't be easily justified doesn't become a stirring legend. Sixth, the changing scale of warfare made Multan seem small. By the time Britain fought world wars that killed millions, a 9-month siege with a few thousand casualties seemed insignificant. By the time history books were written in the 20th century, colonial campaigns like Multan were dismissed as minor police actions rather than the genuinely difficult military challenges they actually were. Seventh, there's a historiographical bias toward European battlefields. British military history has traditionally focused on wars against European powers, Napoleon, the Crimea, world wars, while treating colonial campaigns as sideshows. This bias has only recently begun to change as historians recognize that imperial wars were just as significant in shaping global history as conflicts between European states. Despite these factors, military historians have never forgotten Multan. It's studied in staff colleges as a masterclass in improvisation, irregular warfare, and the challenges of siege operations in hostile climates. Edwards's initial campaign is analyzed as an example of how junior officers must sometimes exceed their authority when circumstances demand action. The siege itself is examined for its lessons about combining regular and irregular forces, using artillery superiority, and maintaining operational momentum. More importantly, Multan represented a turning point in global history that reverberates even today. The annexation of the Punjab gave Britain control of the entire Indian subcontinent, a position that would last until 1947. The borders drawn then, the administrative structures created, the political divisions fostered would all contribute to the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan. The city where Mulraj made his stand is now in Pakistan. The territories he fought to defend are split between two nuclear-armed nations whose rivalry has nearly triggered multiple wars. History is long. The consequences of Multan extended far beyond 1849, shaping the world we live in today, in the end. The Siege of Multan deserves to be remembered not just as another colonial campaign, but as a fascinating example of how complex historical forces intersect with individual courage, improvisation, and chance. Remember the date, April 19th, 1848, when a brutal murder sparked a rebellion that threatened to undo British power in India. Remember the audacity. A 28-year-old lieutenant with no authorization and minimal forces deciding he wouldn't wait for orders, but would instead raise an army and march immediately against impossible odds. Remember the improvisation, Pashtun irregulars, Sikh regulars of questionable loyalty, Muslim troops from Bahawalpur, and a handful of British officers cobbling together a military force from nothing and somehow making it work. Remember the resilience. Mulraj holding out for 9 months, despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and knowing that defeat would mean the end of everything he'd fought to preserve. Remember the professionalism, soldiers on both sides fighting with courage and skill, defending positions that couldn't be defended, attacking fortifications that couldn't be taken, enduring heat and disease and exhaustion that killed as surely as enemy fire. Remember the human cost. Thousands dead, a wealthy city reduced to ruins. Families destroyed, a proud empire brought to its knees. Remember that this wasn't really about British versus Indians or Christians versus Sikhs. It was about power, control, and the brutal logic of imperial competition. The Sikh Empire had been built on conquest just as surely as the British Empire. The question wasn't whether Punjab would be ruled by foreigners. It had been ruled by outsiders for centuries, but which group of outsiders would dominate? Remember that sometimes, at critical moments in history, individual actions matter enormously. If Edwards had waited for orders, the rebellion might have spread beyond control. If Mulraj had been slightly more competent or slightly luckier, he might have held out long enough for a general uprising. If Sher Singh and Mulraj had joined forces instead of going separate ways, they might have defeated the British field armies and preserved Sikh independence. History turns on such moments. Remember that the men who fought at Multan, British and Irish troops sweltering in wool uniforms, Sikh defenders fighting for their homeland, Pashtun irregulars seeking plunder and glory, sepoys caught between competing loyalties, were all equally brave and equally deserving of respect. War doesn't sort people into heroes and villains. It creates impossible situations where ordinary people do extraordinary things, good and bad, under unbearable pressure. And remember Herbert Benjamin Edwards, the 28-year-old lieutenant who gambled his career, his reputation and his life on the belief that audacity could accomplish what caution could not. He paid for that gamble with a mangled hand, years of brutal service, and a shortened life. But he won. Against all odds and contrary to all military wisdom, he won. On a dusty plain in the Punjab, in heat that would kill unprepared men, with troops who barely knew each other and barely trusted their commander, he proved that sometimes the impossible is merely difficult. This is our history, and it's worth remembering, not to glorify empire or justify conquest, but to understand how the world we inherited was forged through courage, desperation, and the collision of cultures that shaped modern South Asia. The walls of Multan have long since been rebuilt. The fortress stands again. But the echoes of that 9-month siege still resonate through the borders. The identities, the memories of 200 million people who live in the lands that Mulraj fought to defend and Edwards fought to subdue. Sometimes history forgets the battles that mattered most, but we don't have to.